to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged.
If you're listening to this, you are the resistance. The resistance.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
It's a trap!
All right, everybody, welcome to the Oh Hail Yeah Show. My guest today is Mr. Selwyn Duke. He's smarter than you are, so you should pay attention. Hello, Selwyn. How are you? Nice to have you on the show.
Well, I'm still alive, TJ, and how are you?
I'm doing wonderful, and I enjoyed reading your last article. For those who are not familiar with you, you write articles, you write them well, and you write them often, so they should definitely check you out. Where's the best place they can do that? At your home site or in one of your outposts?
Yeah, that would be my own website, selwynduke.com. I'm usually read elsewhere, but it's a repository for all my pieces, so everything I write will be found there. Gotcha. And notice, TJ, that when I greeted you today, I did not pull an Obama. I did not say, "Hey, Bill, how you doing?" You know, that guy never knows who he's talking to or where he is, huh?
Well, his job is not to know too much.
Yeah, so. It's like he'll say, "Hey, Poughkeepsie, how you doing?" And Mr. President, it's Oshkosh.
So, actually, you know, it's funny. The first time that I emailed you before I had started my show was after reading an article that you did on American Thinker, a site I enjoy, and it was about the time that I think Bill O'Reilly had said, you know, I would definitely love to hear some cogent arguments against gay marriage, but they're nowhere to be found. I mean, there's no one articulating any, and you had just written a brilliant article about it. And I think your comment when I emailed you was to go on the show was, yeah, I don't think that'll happen anytime soon. Do you and Bill have is there a tiff in your relationship? What's going on there?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's just that he really doesn't have anyone on who thinks outside the box. That's the bottom line. And what you mentioned is something, TJ, that really does frustrate me because I've been putting forth some very powerful arguments against faux marriage for a very, very long time. And by and large, other conservatives have not been picking up on them. I mean, one or two have, but that's about it. And it just strikes me that when people argue this before the courts, they argue the issue incorrectly. It's just unbelievable. And then everyone says, well, no one on the right has any cogent arguments, any logical arguments. Well, the truth is that it's the people on the left who are just playing upon emotion. They're engaging in demagoguery. It's the equality of marriage. It's just sloganeering. That's all it is. But that's very, very powerful because most people operate on an emotional level. And I don't know if you want me to get into the arguments that I've put forth with respect to faux marriage, but I can certainly do that.
Sure. I actually I dabble in a little Facebook battling every now and then. We get into it, and I'm typically the contrarian. But this came up the other day, and you mentioned the sloganeering, the wordsmithing, well, it's about love and love first and equality. And I'm thinking those really have very little to do with the actual subject matter at hand. I'll throw out some arguments, and eventually they'll get bored and, post something about the Kardashians. So I realize it's futile, but yeah, shoot a couple of them at me.
Well, first, you might have noticed that I termed it faux marriage, not gay marriage. And that's because, and here's a very big term, but gay marriage is an oxymoronic euphemism or a euphemistic oxymoron. And the reason why I do that is that there was a great book written many years ago, I think in the 1950s, maybe even the 30s, titled The Tyranny of Words. And its basic theme is that the side that defines the vocabulary of a debate wins the debate. And that is, of course, true. If you say, let's take this example, say that you have in a given area a French culture and a German culture, TJ, both vying for primacy. They want their culture to prevail. Well, if all the French people could convince all the German people to speak French, they would have won half the battle before it had even begun, right? Well, it's the same thing in our culture wars. What we do is we debate the left, but we use constantly what I call the lexicon of the left, their preferred vocabulary. Gay marriage we use. We'll say underprivileged or disadvantaged instead of poor. We'll say gender instead of sex when gender only used to refer to words, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the reasons why we have lost half the culture war before it's even begun. But let me get into the arguments pertaining to marriage in particular. What I always say to people with respect to faux marriage is this. I said, okay, what if I told you that homosexuals already have a right to get married? They always did. They could have chosen to enter into a union with a member of the opposite sex, just like anyone else.
I would say bigotry. Bigotry.
Yeah, right. The left is going to say, whoa, wait a second, but that's your definition of marriage. That's not necessarily our definition of marriage. We don't agree that it's just a union of two people of the opposite sex. And I would say, okay, Okay, here's what I say to that. Then you tell me what your definition is. And that's the problem. When these homosexual lobbyists come to the courts or come to the court of public opinion to argue this, they never really provide an alternative definition. All they do is they say, well, we want homosexuals to, quote, marry. But they never say, okay, well, the traditional definition is wrong, but here's our definition. It's the union of any two people. They don't do that, actually. They don't give you a hard and fast definition. And the reason why they don't, TJ, is that if they did that, they'd be putting themselves in a box and they'd lose this illusory moral high ground they have. And something they use, a cudgel they use to hammer the right. And that is, they will say to people like us, well, you're exclusionary, you're discriminatory, setting these boundaries for marriage. But if they set their own boundaries, they'll be doing the exact same thing. They'll just be drawing the line in a different place. So they don't do that. But you see, the problem with what they do is actually multifaceted. For one thing, if you don't provide an alternative definition, a hard and fast definition, you are not redefining marriage. That's what conservatives accuse them of. No, that's giving them too much credit. They are not redefining marriage. They are, as I've put it many times, undefining it. They're simply opening the door for anything and everything. And this is why when conservatives say, well, this is going to lead to the legalization of polygamy and all other conceptions of marriage, they're correct, because an undefinition excludes nothing. The only way you can rightly say that your agenda excludes these other things is if you offer a hard and fast definition. But they don't do that. But that isn't even the linchpin of my argument. And I know I'm going on for a long time here, so if you want to chime in, feel free to, your show. But here's the thing. What I say is, okay, you're going to say that you don't agree with our definition of marriage. Then that is the issue, isn't it? The issue is not a matter of rights. It's a matter of definitions, because how can you possibly say that there's a right to a thing until you first establish what that thing is? What is marriage? What are we talking about? Are we talking about the union between a man and a woman in holy matrimony? Are we talking about the union between any two adults, any two people, any number of adults? What is marriage? And this is why the courts, TJ, have behaved so illogically, because the plaintiffs have come to them, the homosexual lobbyists, without an alternative definition. And the courts have been ruling that there's a right to they know not what. Before they can say that there's a right to something, they have to define what it is. What the court should have said, if they would have behaved logically, was, well, wait a second. The only operative definition we have of marriage in our society is the long-held one, a man and a woman in holy matrimony. That's it. And homosexuals have a right to participate in that. So unless you can show how that definition is not correct and offer an alternative hard and fast one, we have no business ruling in this area, because, TJ, if anything is above the court's pay grade, it's determining what marriage is. That's not their role. That's not their role at all. Society has already done that. And the courts should have said what I just articulated. We cannot rule here. The homosexuals already have a right to marriage as society has defined it, and that is it.
Yeah, the undefinition word is key. In fact, as you were talking about the lexicon of the left, I think about I take everything back to Alinsky, since he kind of showed the methods and the ways of the cunning linguists here. But the main one is, and I forget which rule it is, if it's number 4, but it's make the opposition live up to their own standards. So anytime I see someone arguing, I think, yeah, okay, I'll hold up to my standards, and you're the perfect person to make me do it, since you have none and you hold none. And that's kind of for me, it's the foundation of a lot of the arguments that make no sense, is that there really is no standard that they're adhering to. And, Dawkins came out a couple of years ago, and I just saw this headline get some press recently, and said that Christianity is actually better than the alternatives that we're allowing to come in by desecrating it. Or I'm paraphrasing. Did you see that article?
I don't know if I saw that particular one, but I know he's expressed sentiments like that in the recent past. And insofar as that goes, as much as I'm not all that fond of him, I have to say he's much more intellectually honest than most of the people on his side.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, because what he's basically doing, in my opinion, is explaining that you can criticize Christianity for being akin to child abuse, he said, but all of a sudden your life's work starts to culminate, and you see what you've done, and you have to observe honestly that really it's not that, even though you hate it, it's not that bad by comparison. And then he goes on to say it doesn't teach people to do X, Y, Z, and the other, all these terrible things that other cultures prescribe to.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, TJ, because I just put this in print yesterday or the day before, but there was a very interesting study in 2010, at least that's when it was published, coming out of Germany that involved interviews with 45,000 youths. So we're talking about a huge scientific sample. And it studied religiosity and its effect on violence and whatnot. And they found that the more religious Christian youth were, the less likely they were to be violent. But with Muslim youth, it was just the opposite. The greater the religiosity, the more likely they were to become violent. And of course, what this just underlines is that not all religions are equal. You know, in our society, TJ, we're awash in relativism, and corollaries of moral relativism are multiculturalism and religious equivalency doctrine. And we labor under this illusion in America and the West in general that, well, all religions are basically morally equal, and actually it's immoral to say otherwise, which of course is a contradiction because if everything's relative, nothing can be moral or immoral. But the bottom line is this, as I've said 1,000 times, if you're going to say that all religions are equal, then what follows from that is that all ideologies are equal. That means that liberalism would have to be the equivalent of conservatism and Nazism and communism. Now, you might say, whoa, wait a second, Duke. What are you talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is this. What differentiates ideologies qualitatively? It's that they espouse different values, and therefore not all ideologies can be equal unless all values are equal. But the same exact thing can be said about religions. Religions espouse different values. So once again, not all religions can be morally equal unless you believe all values are, which of course is what moral relativists hold, and it's a ridiculous belief. It's a ridiculous pseudo-philosophy. But that's something we labor under, and that's why, by the way, you see this insanity in the West. You see that Sweden is allowing itself to be invaded by unassimilable Muslims, and in fact, they're facilitating it. They're paying for it, and it's all because they bought into this nonsensical relativism, so they cannot distinguish between good and evil. They don't even really believe that good and evil exist.
Yeah, it's funny. I think you wrote an article I read recently about how they, and I had seen it in the headlines, but essentially they're providing marksmanship training for Muslim migrants. And I thought they're making it official. I mean, they put a target on their own back decades ago. So this is just the last straw. And you hear the argument. I read an article recently that they had essentially, when the last incident of rape or abuse or whatever the crime was that's acceptable in Muslim culture happened, the police chief and the politicians are trying to cover it up. And one of them accidentally told the truth, as they're known to do, and said, well, we don't want the right wing using this to get political clout. And I thought, that is insanity. I don't care what political spectrum you're on. If you care about your citizens, you would never say anything or do anything like this. But that tells a lot about what they're really after when they care that little about the people they represent.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, TJ, and this, by the way, is why Trump is doing so well. One of the reasons, Donald Trump. Treason has become the norm in the West. If you stand up for your nation, for your people, you are actually viewed as the outsider. You are viewed as the one who's a revolutionary. And treason is the norm. I'll give you an example. You might remember this story from a few years back. There was some woman who was a realtor who happened to film herself going by a house where they were flying the Mexican flag. And she was asking the people, well, this is America. Why are you flying a foreign flag? Now, regardless of what you think about her approach, the bottom line is that if you should be on anyone's side, it should be hers. She was standing up for patriotism and for our country, but instead she was castigated in the media, she lost her realtor job, and she was treated like a pariah. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. We've turned everything on its head, and a civilization cannot survive if it has that attitude. People have to understand something. What is a nation? A nation is an extension of the tribe, which itself is an extension of the family. Okay, to not defend your nation is like not defending your family. And again, if you don't do that, if you just open your doors to anyone and everyone, let anyone who wants to come into your home, help himself to your goodies, your food, your refrigerator, put him in close proximity to your children, even though you don't know whether or not he's a child molester, and basically place yourself at his mercy, well, your family's not going to survive very long.
Yeah, that was the when the refugees started piling in, or even back when they were coming over the northern border. Was that 2014 or 15 now? I'm losing track. With that 500,000 young children that we found out later the government had actually chartered buses for to make sure they got to the right areas of the country so they couldn't be sent back. But the thought is,
Yeah.
okay, how many people is Obama going to have living in his basement or sleeping in the trundle bed in his room? Probably zero. This is my problem, not theirs.
Right. Well, exactly. And of course, I think you know as well as I do why Obama is interested in doing this, why all the other leftists are. It's not that they care about these folks. It's that once these people are naturalized, statistics show that they vote 70 to 90% for socialistic Democrats. So what the left is doing is it's importing its voters. And this has been going on, by the way, TJ, since 1965. I don't know how much you've touched on this on your show, but up until 1965, from I believe it was 1924 to 1965, we admitted people in accordance with something known as the National Origins Act. And basically what that Immigration Act stated was that a given group of immigrants, let's say Italians or Germans, could only be let in accordance with that ethnicity's overall percentage of the American population. So if, let's say, people of Italian descent represented, just for argument's sake, 10% of the American population, only 10% of immigrants in a given year could be Italian. Now, the purpose of this was to maintain the demographic balance of the United States, which is very important because demography is destiny, or demographics is destiny. If you allow your demographic balance to be upset to a great degree and very, very quickly, that leads to domestic unrest. But what happened was that in 1965, this was completely overthrown. The politicians, Ted Kennedy was pushing this in the Senate. It was actually the Hart-Celler Act introduced into Congress. They proposed something called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and that created a situation where now every year 85% of our immigrants hail from the Third World and Asia. And again, these are groups who, when they're naturalized, vote for socialistic Democrats 70 to 90%. It's disrupted the demographic balance of America, the culture. It's created a situation where now we're being balkanized. And of course, it's creating an unassailable voting bloc for the left. Why do you think, folks, that California is now a reliably blue state? It was the state of Ronald Reagan. He was elected governor there, a few times? But now Republicans don't have a prayer of carrying that during national elections. The only possible exception, TJ, might be this time around if Trump gets in, because he has actually more crossover appeal than people think. But I don't even think he would. And as California is going, so is the rest of the country. We saw North Carolina, for instance, in 2008. North Carolina actually go for Barack Obama by a slim margin. And a big part of that was demographic change, cultural change as well, brainwashing via academia, entertainment, and the media. But it's a huge, huge factor, and it's turning us into a different nation.
Yeah, I was actually at a chat with my wife. So we got into it over this Sarah Palin thing of her supporting Donald Trump because she's asking, questions about why she would do it. She's more in the camp of Trump's not a conservative. He's not rock solid on all these items that he should be. And I'm more of the opinion of, look, all the right people are upset. We have to put the brakes on this. We have to take certain steps. I think enough people believe that he'll do that, including Democrats. He's going to get their votes. Whereas someone like Cruz, who I think is the right guy for the job. And this has got me in a lot of trouble with my hardcore conservative friends because I think Cruz is the guy for the job. But Trump people are going crazy over how much they hate Trump, which makes me very happy because it's the right people. What are your thoughts on it?
Oh, I agree with you. In fact, I don't know if you saw it, but a while back I wrote an article maybe 2 weeks ago about the Trump phenomenon, and it was very well received. And we have never before in the history of America seen anything like the Trump phenomenon. And by the way, when I say that, this has nothing to do with whether you love him or hate him, support him or not, whether or not he's telling the truth, has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the phenomenon that is Donald Trump. Even the Reagan Revolution was nothing at all like this. And here's why I say that. It's very, very interesting. You should read the whole article, all you folks out there, if you want to get the whole kit and caboodle.
I'll link to it.
Yeah, but the bottom line is this. Basically, Trump is succeeding. Why? For a few reasons. One, he's sounding a nationalistic note in a time of universal treason, where treason is the norm, like I said before. And also because he is the first one who has been able to beat back the politically correct thought police. Think about it now. People are sick and tired of being told how to walk and talk and act and think. And he now is the standard bearer for this silenced, not silent, but silenced majority. And understand how powerful what he's doing is, okay? In the past, what always happened was when someone said something politically incorrect, whether it was Jimmy the Greek in the 1980s, or it was someone more recently, what would generally happen is the media would inveigh against him and demonize him. He might lose his job. If he had a high-profile position, he'd lose that. Like that former fire chief in Atlanta, I don't know if you heard about that. He wrote a book in which he was critical of homosexual behavior, and he lost his position.
That's all it takes.
Right. So the person is ruined. And then what happens, TJ? Well, he could be the most articulate, eloquent spokesman for his cause in the world. But it doesn't matter what he does. He can mount the soapbox on a corner and plead his case. But once his 15 minutes of fame or infamy, however you want to look at it, are over and the media is not paying attention to him, it doesn't matter. It's like he's a tree falling in the forest with no one to hear it. Yeah, he makes a sound, but it doesn't have an impact. Trump is the first person who has been able to trump this. Why? Well, first of all, he's filthy rich, so they can't ruin him. Yeah, he's taken hits because of the stands he's taken. He lost a Macy's contract. He had that problem with his pageant, and he's lost other contracts. Britain is thinking about banning him. But it doesn't matter because it can't hurt him. He's worth $10 billion, and he's willing to take the hits. The second reason they can't do him in, TJ, is very interesting. He doesn't lose his soapbox. He does not lose his forum in which to express his ideas because Trump is that colorful man who the media has always loved to report on. He's always been the one who could colorize a drab news day. And so the media cannot stop covering him. His every word they will publicize. And let's say if the New York Times said, hey, we want to stop this guy, we want to wither him on the vine, okay, they could stop reporting on him, but guess what? They just lose readers to People magazine or other entities.
I've talked about this as the inversion therapy that he did for the media, because typically they can pick and choose who they want to ignore to create the narrative. With Trump, they can't afford to do it. He doesn't need Macy's, but they need Trump. It's kind of hilarious. So you articulated it better than I would, but I think it really ties into the fact that, and this is what I told my wife, because some of these political sites that I follow, they're upset. Even Drudge reported today that Levin says he and Breitbart are in the tank for Trump. But again, I don't think it's that either. And he's not my favorite guy. The point is that Cruz by this time would have been suffocated by the Jeb Bushes and John Kasichs of the Republican establishment, if not for Trump. The only reason I think he even made it this far in his number 2 is because the narrative has been changed. And that I love. I can't get over it. I'm just hot and bothered thinking about it.
Bingo. That's it. So the media can't ignore him. So he can break through this firewall that the media has erected that stops people from expressing those very popular nationalistic and traditionalist ideas. Okay, now I want to expand upon this. I put this in my article too. Why are people rallying behind Trump? It's not just what I just articulated, his nationalistic tone and whatnot. It's like this. Imagine we're back in the Soviet Union, right? Well, what happened there was anyone who opposed the government would be hauled away by the secret police to a gulag, and you might never hear from him again. But imagine that we're back there, and there's some dissident who is saying what everyone is thinking, speaking against the government, but what everyone is afraid to articulate, but they can't do anything about it. The secret police come to take him away, and he consumes them. They fire guns at him, and the bullets just bounce off him. Imagine, TJ, the kind of hero he would become to the average person. They would be rallying behind him. That is analogous to the Trump phenomenon. Trump is that dissonant. He says these nationalistic and traditionalist things that lots of people are thinking but are afraid to say because they've always feared the politically correct thought police for the reasons that I just mentioned. And when he says these things, the media and others, the establishment, they deploy their usual politically correct weapons. They deploy the politically correct thought police. But he thus far has been immune to those things. Their bullets bounce off him. And that's why he's becoming a hero to the common man. That is why. He is analogous to that dissident. And that is also why it doesn't even matter about Trump's past. It doesn't matter to these people that he supported liberal causes and liberal candidates in the past. It doesn't matter to them that he's been married a few times, because when you have a hero leading you into battle against a hated enemy who no one before has been able to resist, you don't worry about those things. You just charge in behind him. And that is the Trump phenomenon.
Well said. And I, selfishly, I'm thinking of myself, or if I have people who run for office, I'm like, you not only that. So I'm a Cardinals fan, right? And I can come out of the closet this season because they're playing really well. This is NFL. For every 15 years or so, we come out, we celebrate. But he's shown a roadmap. It's almost like game film. Anyone running in the future can see the roadmap to beating the media complex, to beating liberal liars that will, you look at Obama, and I have friends who don't even know that he won his first couple elections by unsealing court records and humiliating people out of the race. There you go for your biggest accomplishment of winning an election. But he's shown the way. So I thought, if I ever want to be somebody in the real world, I know in politics, I know that I can survive by telling people they're stupid and to go, stick it, where, which is what Trump's been doing. And it's refreshing in a very...
Right. Yeah, well, right. You said before that people are saying that he's not a conservative. Well, that's true. You know what he is? He's a nationalistic populist. That's what he is. And he's proving
that's scary.
That what's not popular is political correctness. And I have to explain that because, yes, political correctness is the default social code of our time. But what I mean is, the average person, insofar as he recognizes political correctness, is not politically correct. Yes, he may embrace many politically correct suppositions that now have for decades been woven into our society, but insofar as he recognizes political correctness, he rejects it. People do not like, once again, being told how to walk and talk and act and think. They don't like having to walk on eggshells. And that's what they have to do because of the politically correct thought police. And like I said, he's the one who's shown that political correctness is greatly an illusion, the popularity of it, and he's the one that's successfully opposing it, and that's why he's so popular.
You mentioned earlier about moral superiority, and I think it was Ben Shapiro who had an article talking about defeating the unearned moral superiority of the opposition. And he said that's one of the biggest problems we have is they always assume the moral high ground, although they don't possess it and they don't even believe in it. And that we then start to play into their hand by kind of, if you've seen Back to the Future Part 2, we kind of hang out in this alternate Biff reality that they've created for us rather than just destroying it completely. Sorry, I grew up on a steady stream of pop culture. So you've mentioned moral superiority. I'm thinking about some of the articles you've written about. You've got climate change, you've got the overpopulation, you've got, which are obviously lies that have had to been altered as evidence comes out that disproves these theories, right? Climate change was global cooling, then global warming. Now it's undefined. It's everything. It's weather, it's climate, it's not weather, it's not climate. The population bomb, I mentioned, same thing. You've got the decimation of the military. You've got the white Oscars. The thing I got on Facebook the other day, and I had a friend of mine jump on me for saying, and this is why I don't get on Facebook, that part of the problem, if not, I hinted that part of the problem with black culture is that they've decimated the family and they've forced the father out of the home. And I showed a graph basically showing black economic statistics, quality of living statistics on par with whites up until a couple decades ago, where they just totally went sideways. And the comment I got was hilarious. I actually want to read this to you. I took the time to copy it.
Okay.
Because I showed all these statistics, and he said, you seem to be discounting the effects of hundreds of years of murder, slavery, discrimination, isolation, lack of access to education, and all manners of oppression when you conclude that the current issues in the black community are due to the breakdown of what you deem to be the nuclear family. That's ridiculous and patently reckless. And I said, okay, well, what's your solution? He said, well, I think feigning actual honest interest. He said, feigning, continue to work on getting the black community equal education in terms of access and quality, provide more vocational and skills training, assess the quality of equal, once the access and quality equal with whites generally have in this country, give them 200 years to let the cumulative effects build up, generation over generation, and probably in about 400 years, things will equal out. I kid you not. This is what I got back. I thought, there's a solution right there. That'll fix our problems. And then I said, well, you ignored all the stats, so that's convenient. And he referred to it as the new Jim Crow, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You can wiki it. And then the microaggression and the fact that I'm racist, whether I know it or not, whether I act out or not, or whether I say or do anything that means I'm racist. It's there. There's nothing I can do about it except pay up. So what do we do about this unearned moral superiority? And the fact that if the facts don't match reality on the liberal side, they just make up a new theory for why things are the way they are and how we're going to fix them.
Right. Well, before I get to that, let me just say something about what you just mentioned. That is the old cop-out when they start talking about the legacy of slavery. Now, here I will quote Dr. Walter Williams, who, if people are interested, is a black man. He said, well, if all that is true, if this just has to do with the legacy of slavery, why is it that black people living closer to the time of slavery were actually in a better social state, far better, than they are today? The black family was intact. The black unemployment rate was far lower. Black kids were well behaved. They tended to be disciplined. Okay, it has nothing to do with slavery. The bottom line is that you mentioned the breakdown in the black family. Well, 72 or 73% of black children are now born out of wedlock. And that tells the tale right there. The men aren't around, so you have a civilization or a culture that is in disarray. You know, basically, they like to say that the black culture now is matriarchal. Well, that is true in a way, but here I'll quote G.K. Chesterton, one of the smartest men who ever lived. He said, in practice, matriarchy is when all the men are running around renegade and irresponsible. And isn't that what we see in the black community now? Yes, it is exactly what we see. But anyway, I want to get on to the more important issue. You said, how do we counteract this faux moral superiority that they have? Well, it's very, very simple. And I'm glad you mentioned that because it reminded me, TJ, of something that I should have mentioned with respect to the Trump phenomenon. Another reason why Trump is so popular, and he could not be popular without this, is this. Let's say you went into a John Wayne movie. I know I'm going back many, many years, okay? But he was a big hero. He always played a hero on screen.
I'll look him up. I'll link to him for people who aren't familiar with him.
Yeah, John Wayne, his nickname was the Duke, but not like me. I'm the real Duke. But anyway, let's say instead of standing up to evil and playing the hero, he sheepishly apologized even though he was right. Well, you'd be very disappointed. You might even want to walk out of the movie theater and ask for your money back, right? The same thing happens in the real world when conservatives are right, but nonetheless allow themselves to be cowed by the thought police and apologize. They lose all right they ever would have had to hero status. They relinquish it. Who's going to rally behind someone and stand behind him if he won't stand up for himself? And notice, what does Trump do? He never apologizes. He doesn't apologize, so he doesn't relinquish that hero status. Even if he's wrong, he doesn't apologize. And people are not used to seeing this. And that's another reason why they rally behind him. And what is the solution? Well, I've put this into effect myself. Take the offense. The best defense is a good offense. If they try to cow you with accusations of racism or sexism or homophobia, by the way, those are all part of the lexicon of the left. Turn the tables on them. Say to them, listen, the only reason you're accusing me of racism is because you're a bigot yourself. It's because I'm white. If I weren't white, you wouldn't be leveling that accusation. That's how you do it. If they're talking about white privilege, which I've debated on the radio, you do what I did. You say, you know something? You're peddling this nonsense about white privilege only because you want to leverage more disadvantages against white people, leverage more affirmative action and more quotas. It's terrible what you're doing, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You ought to stop it. You're creating a discriminatory environment, and you are doing wrong. That's how you handle it. The best defense is a good offense.
Good punch in the face. Yeah, and there's a couple other articles you had here you'd written about that I wanted to bring up. There's a great hit list here. Where should we even start? Let's see. I've got Obama spent $700 million promoting homosexuality overseas and bought 3 will. There's Missouri. There's the Pentagon putting women in all combat roles. This is one that I think is interesting. I want to talk about this. 13 Hours just came out. Did you see it, by the way?
No, I have not.
Are you interested in seeing it?
You know, I have to say maybe down the road, but I have not been to a movie theater of my own volition in probably 15 years now.
Oh, I see. On principle?
Yeah, I'm just not interested in doing it. I don't want to support Hollywood. I'm not really a fan of modern culture. I know that probably comes as a big shock to you.
Yeah.
But if you want to understand what I am for your audience, the best way I can describe myself is Mayberry meets the Middle Ages.
When did you go against your own volition?
Oh, well, when I had to write some movie reviews for the New American, I did that a couple of times. So then I actually went. It was part of my job. But that was it. The last movie that I went to voluntarily, I can tell you, was The Passion of the Christ.
Okay. So let's talk about the decimation of the military. This 13 hours thing, I'm working on a YouTube video right now because there's obviously it's getting hammered in left-wing media. Hillary Clinton said she was too busy to watch it, which I thought was ironic because she was too busy to save their lives too. So she's just super busy, even though she can't drive or send text messages. But the thing for me is the people that were there that survived all left the CIA. They all resigned. And I thought, I'm shocked. But you're seeing that with a lot of military personnel in high positions that don't really like what's happening. What choice do they have? They have to obey the orders they're given. So the best thing they can do is just leave, which means there's a vacuum that gets filled in by activists, which I see all the time. And I wonder, what's the long-term effect of that going to be? Well, you already described it. It's demography determines destiny, and the demography of the military is definitely changing. So when I see that we've decided to put women in combat roles at the front lines, now look, I've seen a couple ladies who I wouldn't want to see in a dark alley. I'm sure I can't say anything about those ones, but my father-in-law's a firefighter, I have cops, and they will all tell you the same thing, that while intellectually and in some ways women are just as capable, you have to be a complete idiot to argue that physically they're on par. So you wrote a great article about it. Let's talk about why that's happening, what the result's going to be.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is just part of this ridiculous equality agenda. First of all, no one really believes in equality. No one who's actually thought about it deeply. And I'll tell you why I say that. If you look at what these leftists pursue in terms of policy, they don't actually pursue equality. Here's just one little example. This pops into my mind. I remember reading about 8 months ago this story about some 10-year-old girl who was playing on some boys' basketball team, and they were going to have some statewide tournament or national tournament, and she was not allowed to play on the team because it was only for boys, right? And everyone was complaining about this and whatnot, and they were talking about inequality, and they were saying, well, this is 2015. I mean, how can this be allowed?
I love being reminded what year it is, by the way. That's one of I put that right at the level of people who accuse you of watching Fox News. It's somewhere, right, probably on par.
Yeah, this occurred in 2015. That's why I say it's 2015. It's not that I don't know what year it is.
Oh, no, but that's, anyway, when someone's, hey, it's 2016, and that's why, that's their argument for why something should happen, because of what year it is.
Right.
Go on.
Right, exactly. As if truth changes, and it doesn't. It's eternal. But here's the thing. The true equality argument didn't occur to anyone who was debating the issue, not even the person who was from the basketball league in question who was defending the policy. And what I mean is this. There was a corresponding girls' team for her to play on, which the boys could not participate in. They could not play on that team. So actually, what the feminists were asking for here was not equality. They were asking for a special dispensation for this girl, for her to be allowed to play in a boys' basketball league when the boys do not have the corresponding right. But that argument didn't even occur to anyone. And that's because, again, no one really believes in equality. The whole scream or cry of equality is simply a ruse that people use when convenient in order to tear down traditions that they don't happen to like, that stand in the way of their agenda. Let me give you another example, again, pertaining to sports. I used to be a tennis pro many moons ago in another life. And anyway, there was a big argument a long time ago about how women should get equal prize money at the U.S. Open and whatnot. And of course, they eventually achieved that. But here's what no one pointed out. How can you possibly ask for equality when you're supporting a system that is inherently unequal? And what I mean is we have separate tours, leagues, and teams for women to compete in and on. True equality is everyone competes together, and then you let the cream rise to the top. So what I said when I was writing about this way back when was, well, hey, if the women want the men's money, it's really simple. Compete on the men's tour. That's how maybe you can get the men's money. But again, it's an example of how the leftists want to have their cake and eat it too. They're arguing for equality, and no one notices that they're supporting an inherently unequal system. Now, TJ, I'm not out of touch with reality. I know that women couldn't compete in men's sports. I often like to cite this example. The mile world record for 15-year-old boys is better than the women's world record. But the point is then just acknowledge that and stop with the equality nonsense.
What's the transgender record? What's that?
So the intergender record or cisgender, whatever it is.
So you don't know your numbers. You got to go back and do your research. Obviously, you're not educated on this topic. Then you're done.
Oh, you want to know what the times are?
No, I'm just saying that, in traditional gender norms, which don't apply anymore, you would be correct. But you need to educate yourself on the topic if you're going to speak as an authority. I ran into that one the other day.
Oh, yes, I know, because now Facebook, I think, defines something like 60 or 70 different genders that one can choose from on Facebook.
How can you know what you're talking about in terms of records and norms when you don't even understand the nature of gender? I mean, it's not just sexual. Obviously, I don't know the last time you visited a college campus, but yeah, you should probably educate yourself on that one, Selwyn.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic because, as you probably know, I've written at length about that. And I don't know if you want to get into it because it's sort of complicated. But the whole gender agenda is based on nothing but nonsense. There is no sound science behind it whatsoever. The left loves to say to people like us that we're unscientific when talking about climate change and evolution. They are quintessentially unscientific because they are peddling something that is nothing more than what a witch doctor would be peddling, perhaps, if he were so inclined. But again, I don't know if you want to get into it.
No, I like that you touch on equality because I say that all the time. Like, it is a myth. It's a total myth. And it's funny. I don't even know where to start with this, but I think you summed it up pretty well. But the thing about putting women in front of the combat line, like the myth, I can see where it's about money or power, but I mean, I kind of equate it to Obama appointing women to cabinet positions where they can go out and lie, like spokespersons. You've got Susan Rice. You've got, what's the gal's name that said ISIS needs more jobs? She's one of my favorites.
Oh, I know who you're talking about, but her name escapes me too.
I'm like, to be totally unqualified is one thing. To use them as stooge to report your agenda, to me, is borderline evil. Like, I kind of snicker when it's the van driver who said, dude, that was 2 years ago. But when they take these women out there and have them parrot the lies, it just seems wrong to me. And then you think about a military situation where how many people are going to get killed because you've got a woman in the foxhole next to you who you feel differently about than the men that are your equals. It's crazy. It's insanity.
Yeah. Well, you have to remember, though, TJ, I mean, we have to be fair and equality-minded now. Women can lie every bit as well as men, and they have a right to have an opportunity to do so, don't they?
I know what I was going to say. Actually, it was this. It was the thing that drives me crazy about equality, especially with the genders, is that you have these women in the corporate world, whether it's movies, whether it's in Silicon Valley, like Marissa Mayer, talking about how they can do everything a man can do. They should get paid the same man can do. Whereas you have, in true femininity, you have things that women can do that are beautiful and sacred and unique. And those are totally discounted. They're too busy pursuing things that men can do that are almost totally meaningless.
Right, in my opinion. Right. Well, Mother Teresa said many, many years ago, she said something to the effect of women should tend to the home and allow men to do what they're better suited to do. But, it's interesting in the military because, again, everyone's talking about equality, but actually when women are allowed to join the Marines and whatnot and they go through basic training, there is no equality because what inevitably happens is that they dumb down the standards in order to grease the skids for women to get through because when they don't, they find that they just don't pass muster in terms of the physical tests. That's what's really going on. And it creates a very bad environment inside the military. But really the biggest issue, TJ, is something that no one wants to mention and that not that many people are in touch with nowadays. And it's simply this. It does not behoove us as a civilization to masculinize women and feminize men. It just doesn't. That way lies madness and the destruction of civilization. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing with all this girl power imagery in movies and on shows. It's what we're doing when we're pushing women into the military. But of course, you see, it's funny because it's also unsustainable. Sustainability is a big word nowadays among the left. Well, how about this for unsustainability? Here is one of the byproducts of the feminist paradigm. What happens is when women take on masculine ambitions and roles, they put off child rearing. Sometimes they don't have children at all. Sometimes they just have one child because they're trying to have them later in life. And then what happens is the birth rate starts to plummet. And this is what has happened all over Western civilization. If you look at the people, TJ, who created Western civilization, they all have fertility rates below replacement level, which is 2.2 children per woman. And what that means is that they're extinguishing themselves. And what that means is that the feminist paradigm is unsustainable. So we can continue pursuing it, but all it's going to mean is that Western peoples will extinguish themselves and their feminist values and liberal values will disappear along with them, and they're going to be replaced by a more patriarchal culture. And what might that be? Well, Islam is a more patriarchal culture. Muslim cultures, that's a possibility. But this is what's going on, and it's inescapable. What I gave you, what I laid out, is a fact. if we do not right the ship and we do not stop going down the road of this feminist liberal nonsense, we're just going to disappear. And then, of course, that's poetic justice, because if people will worship a culture of death and will not reproduce themselves, then I guess they don't really have a right to exist anymore, do they?
Ooh, bam. I actually was thinking about, I want to clarify what I said by meaningless. I live by the mantra that no matter what you choose to do in life, it won't matter if you haven't chosen to perform well in the home, right? Right. Because what we do, and I tell my wife, like, you could, whether I'm Donald Trump or some guy who sweeps streets, like, none of it's as important as our family and the things that you do here. And that's just totally been discarded in society. So when I see these women doing the things you talk about, putting off having kids, putting off getting married, having abortions to climb the career ladder, I'm just thinking this is total deception. And when Gavin McGinnis was on a show recently, he got a lot of airtime for telling one of the feminist announcers that she'd be a lot happier being home and being married. He got flayed in the media, but I had to laugh because I'm thinking, I believe that 100%. Like, we lead boring, ambitious, yet boring. We have jobs and they give us satisfaction, but what does it mean in the end? It means nothing. Like, it's all about the kids and the family. And some people don't agree with it, fine. But ultimately, what do you have at the end of your life? There was some executive who died recently and they're fighting over his $500 million estate, and he gave a whole bunch of it to his dogs. And I thought, that makes me sad inside, that those are the things, people that he felt, the items that he felt cared the most about him that he could trust were the dogs. And I'm sorry to you people who are dog super uber lovers, but that's what I think about when I hear equality being preached. I'm like, why don't you celebrate what you have, the ability to give life and nurture human beings? Like, is that not important? You want to come to work with me? Okay, have at it.
Right. Well, the bottom line is this. I'm going to quote G.K. Chesterton again here, but when you have a career, okay, you go into an office and you're doing the same thing all the time, and then you retire after a few decades, and maybe they give you a retirement party. But the truth is some years down the road, no one's going to care about the fact that you were there. No one's going to remember you. And you were just doing that one thing all the time. When you're raising a child, you are everything to that child. And as G.K. Chesterton put it, how can you compare being the same thing to everyone to being everything to someone? And that really is the bottom line. When you're raising a child and you're a mother and you're in the home, you are everything to that child. I can't quote something else Chesterton said about it, which was very long and very profound, but basically he said, well, you're the teacher to that child. You're the spiritual advisor to that child. You're that child's philosopher. You're that child's government. You're that child's nurturer. You're that child's farmer. You're the one who feeds them. You're everything to that child. That's a very, very important thing. You're molding, hopefully, one of the saints of the future. There's no more important thing you could possibly do. Is that going to compare to being an accountant? Is that going to compare to even being some lawyer and spending your time in court, or to being some secretary? There's no comparison. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Or even a famous movie star who, by the way, female movie stars have a shorter lifespan than running backs in the NFL. I'm sorry. It's just not that important.
Right, exactly. And, Chesterton said something funny about this in the early 1900s when feminism was really gaining full steam, because back then, I guess, being a stenographer was a big job among women, one of the jobs they got into first. He said,
Awesome.
10,000 women left the home saying that they didn't want to be dictated to, so they became stenographers.
Probably for 77 cents on the dollar, too.
Yeah, that's another myth.
Talk about inequality.
Wage gap has to do with discrimination.
I'm really curious about something in terms of, so I have my primary business, which is my Shark Tank podcast on the business side, but I'm really influenced by politics and thought and history and these other things that you specialize in. But I'm curious, I see your writings in a lot of different places. Talk to me about the life of a writer. How did you get started? Were you always ideologically where you are now? And tell me about how you make your living in the profession.
Okay, that's a good question. And actually, I've never been asked that before on the air. They always want to stick to business, politics, social issues. Nothing about Selwyn Duke. And I've got a huge ego, so how could that be?
Yeah. Lay it on me. No, I am curious. I mean, there's so many people clawing and competing for those eyeballs, but, some of the people who do it really well, like yourself, I'm just curious what the lifestyle's like and how you get there.
Yeah, well, I have long been ideologically inclined. I would say that I was a conservative by the time I was 12, but I wasn't really into politics back then. I was just a normal kid. But what happened was when I got into my later teens, I started listening to talk radio. Bob Grant, for instance, here on the East Coast, he was the king of talk radio in the East at the time. And I would think a lot about it. I started reading U.S. News and World Report back when it actually was still a good publication. Since then, it swung left, if it's even still around. But then what happened was I was a competitive tennis player, like I said, but I wasn't just thinking about faults and aces and things like that. I spent a lot of time pondering human nature and politics and social issues and seeking the truth. And I'm making a long story short here because I also experienced during this phase a spiritual conversion. I went from being an agnostic and a hedonist to a devout Catholic. But anyway, what happened was when I was in my 30s, actually mid-30s, I said, I want to spread the truth in some way. I believe that that's my calling. And obviously, the logical way to do it is via the word, the written and spoken word. So let me get into writing. But at first, I didn't really have much of a forum. All I could do was start my own blog, which initially I called the Truth Page, going back very far. And I didn't know who was going to read me, but someone close to me said, well, just do it. That's what you should do. And I figured, well, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, after all, my job is not to be a bean counter. My job is not to worry about whether I'm going to make money or how widely read I'm going to be, how successful I'm going to be. My job is to write, and God's going to take care of the rest. So I did that, and I started submitting my work to as many online entities as I could, and it built up from there. After 4.5 years, I got paid for the first time, but that was just for one article. And then eventually I started working for the New American, and they pay me on a regular basis. I write exclusives for them, but I also write syndicated pieces that are disseminated widely. And that's how it went. Now, of course, it is hard to break through the noise, TJ, as you indicated, because there are so many people out there writing. And unfortunately, also, you basically have this syndicate of the mainstream media, the leftist establishment. And if you don't walk to the beat of their politically correct drummer, they just don't want to give you a place at the table. And that is the hardest aspect of the whole thing. I always like to say that the leftists in the media are sort of like the sentient programs in the movie The Matrix. They guard all the gates and they hold all the keys. And again, if you don't toe their line and push their agenda, it's very hard to get your message out. But I have had my successes for a very long time. I was a regular guest on Michael Savage's show, which is the second most or third most listened to radio talk show in the nation, number one on the internet. And my work has been republished, believe it or not, in college reference textbooks. I know as politically correct as academia is, it's hard to believe. So I have made some headway, but it's very, very difficult to get the truth out there. But as I said before, I just let God take care of that. I look at it this way. If you have ambitions in baseball, what do? You don't say, well, you give me a major league contract and then I'll start training and practicing. No, if you love baseball and that's where your passions lie, you practice, you get involved in baseball, and then you let the chips fall where they may.
You go out there and you start throwing the ball against the barn door, right? Over and over and over again.
Yeah, and you hope that you throw more strikes than foul balls.
So your mainstream tilt was on Savage's show. Are you still a guest there? That's pretty cool.
No. Actually, as far as I know, I've appeared on that show more than any other individual guest, but I haven't been on there in a while because we had sort of a falling out. But that was just a misunderstanding on Savage's part. I still like him. I still have the utmost respect for him. And who knows, maybe one day I'll be on there again.
Yeah, I think, and the reason I bring this up is because my generation, you're seeing kids don't watch TV. They don't read the newspaper. They get their which is why I like podcasting and YouTube, because anything that they can get, they have to be able to get off their smartphone. Otherwise, they're not going to get it. So I'm kind of looking at, in the future, the next generation of influencers and thought leaders, how are they going to really move beyond the way the establishment used to run? Because like you said, they're like sentient programs, but that era is kind of dissolving a little bit. I mean, you look at some of the people who are disrupting the media industry, and now people with a YouTube channel get more views than people on MSNBC. I mean, there are people with political shows that crush MSNBC on a daily basis. It's kind of hilarious. So,
Right. Yeah. The only problem there, though, TJ, is that even these big online entities like YouTube are owned by left-wing parties, and they do engage in censorship. For instance, a while back, you might remember this, Google announced that they were no longer going to rank sites based on traffic ranking, based on popularity, but basically based on truth content. Now, of course, that's a euphemism for their ranking the sites based on how they accord with the left-wing agenda, because who's going to be determining truth at Google? These left-wing techies who they hire? The whole thing is ridiculous, but I'll just give you an example of this. A few months ago, I wrote some article about Justin Bieber because it was some political thing. I forget exactly what it was. I don't usually write about him. But anyway, I figured, well, it's an important thing to write about, and his name there should attract some attention. So anyway, I was checking the results on Google, and this article was at the New American. And I noticed that it was nowhere to be found. I checked the results at the time for the last 24 hours. But there was some site called Just Jared, some little blog that mentioned his name that was on the third page. So I checked out the traffic rankings of the New American and Just Jared. The New American was 11,000. Just Jared was something like 187,000. So I'm saying, well, why is it that this site is almost front and center and the New American, a legitimate news site, is nowhere to be found? So I think that's just Google censorship. I think that's just an example of Google cooking the books. But it's what I'm talking about, because what you have to remember is if they want to shut you down by shunting you to some dark corner of the internet and not sending any traffic your way, they can do it. And then once again, it's like I said before, you're like that tree that falls in a forest with no one to hear it. You make noise, but it doesn't have an impact. And Google is very, very powerful, TJ, because as you know, in the United States, they drive a very high percentage of the internet traffic. I think they probably collect something like 85, 90% of advertising revenues in the United States on the internet. I think they probably drive something like 85% of the traffic. So again, if they want to shut you down, they can do it.
Yeah, it's going to be a constant battle, but I think, once you get to the point where you break through the brand name awareness, like in the business side, they always talk about picking your URL and doing your keywords. There are sites like eBay and Amazon and Drudge Report that don't have to worry about that because they've got the recognition and then they're less affected by what Google does. But how do you break it? I think it's the lesser of two evils to just use the system until you can beat it. That's something I chat about with my friends all the time. And you mentioned the lefty liberal tech guys. So my podcast talks a lot about shows like Shark Tank. And the other day I was watching it, and you probably don't watch it because it'd be participating in the liberal patriarchy. But anyway, the guy they had as a guest, Shark, was one of the most successful venture capitalists ever. His company's called Lowercase Capital. It's invested in Twitter and Uber and some of the big up-and-coming companies. And he actually said in a discussion with Mark Cuban when they were talking about this guy had an app that would help you beat traffic tickets, right? So they would do it for free. You send them the ticket and they would help you beat it. And 50% of the time they're successful. And so they got in a discussion about whether or not this is right. And Mark Cuban, who's been persecuted by the SEC and won, said, hey, I have no problem with sticking my boot up the government's you-know-what. And Chris Sacca, this investor, said, you know what? Where do you think that money goes? I mean, we're talking about building schools and libraries and roads. And I thought, well, here's the irony. And I've heard him say crazy liberal things before. One of the most successful tech entrepreneurs of our lifetimes, if ever, since it's an emerging industry, who is talking about driverless cars and eliminating auto ownership in general, just said, who's going to pay for schools and roads if not for those taxes? Did anybody stop and say, hey, what, cut, Chris, that was stupid. You shouldn't have said that. We're going to cut that out. Is that crazy? Or am I the only one who notices this stuff?
No, it is crazy. And I'll also say that that's not supposed to be the purpose of traffic enforcement. But unfortunately, that's what it's become. It's become revenue raising. I know someone who has a son who's a cop, and he said the same thing. It's just revenue raising. A lot of small towns, including mine, do this. They know that by giving parking tickets and whatnot and speeding tickets, they can raise a lot of revenue. But again, that's not supposed to be the purpose of enforcing traffic laws. It's supposed to be a matter of public safety. So yeah, I'm all for ways to try to beat these tickets because the whole system is corrupt to begin with, no question.
Yeah, I just, they make the argument, well, we couldn't have gone to the moon without the government. I'm like, but can we really not build roads and schools? We can't. The guy who invested in Uber is telling us that roads can only get built with the government. I don't see it. I'm sorry. Makes no sense to me. This is smart. So who else do you write for? You got American Thinker, you got the New American.
Well, there's renewamerica.com. That's Alan Key's website. And there are many, many others, many smaller entities. I once appeared in the American Conservative, which used to be Pat Buchanan's magazine, although I wasn't too crazy about one of their editors, so I stopped submitting to them.
So there was something I wanted to ask you about before I forget, and that was this whole thing of PC and moral superiority. And I was thinking about a story my wife told me when she's never been a fan of the Clintons, even from a young kid. She watched Fox News when she was like 10 years old. I didn't watch it till I was in my 20s, didn't even know it existed. And she was in junior high and the teacher was preaching about Bill Clinton because she was in this, harem of women who were jealous of Monica Lewinsky apparently and couldn't hide it at school. And she said something about Bill, and my wife launched an epithet that's not very kind about Bill Clinton in junior high, mind you. This is just how kids talk. Yeah. And the teacher brought my wife up to the front of the class and made her apologize to everyone for saying this about Bill Clinton. And I thought it's ironic a little bit, kind of like the Chris Sacca story, that a teacher of history has so little respect for the First Amendment that she's going to embarrass my wife in front of the entire class for saying something negative about the president. And that kind of sums up public school today, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if your wife used an epithet or not. I mean, certainly teachers can't allow that, but she shouldn't have been peddling that kind of ideology in the class in the first place, the teacher. But yes, there's no question. I mean, we have basically three entities in our society, every society does, that shape culture. You've got the media, you've got entertainment, and you've got academia. And they're very powerful. And if you control, TJ, those three entities, you have the whole kit and caboodle. And they are controlled lock, stock, and barrel today by the left. The long march through the institutions that people talk about? That was an idea promulgated by Anotonio Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist, and he tackled this idea of why Marxism, he lived in the early and mid-1900s, hadn't caught on in the West. And what he said was the problem was that the institutions in the West were quintessentially un-Marxist. They were too traditionalist in a Christian sense. I'm using my own words now. And he said the way to overcome this and pave the way for the acceptance of Marxism is to have a war of position, as he put it. And the war of position was the placement of left-leaning people in all the institutions of Western society, academia, the media, entertainment. And that war of position was completed, TJ, a long time ago. Like I said, they control those entities now. And that is so powerful because, as Abraham Lincoln put it, just talking about the schools now, I'm paraphrasing him, he said, the teaching in the schools today will be the politics of tomorrow. That's absolutely true. You can't get around that. And the media is powerful too. Entertainment is powerful as well. You ask how the homosexual agenda has come to be so widely accepted, especially among the young. That's mainly because of entertainment. Entertainment pushing it in so many ways, portraying homosexual characters as the voice of reason, as being sympathetic, portraying people who are against faux marriage or who stand for traditional sexual morality as being bigots and whatnot. That's very, very, very powerful. Plato said thousands of years ago, the ancient Greek philosopher, just about music. Back then, they didn't have the internet, of course. They didn't have TV. They didn't have our Hollywood. But he said about music, as the music of a state changes, the laws of the state will inevitably change with it. And he said people have embraced this notion, this terrible notion, I'm again paraphrasing, that there's no right or wrong in music, that music should only be judged based on the pleasure it gives. Well, imagine what he would say about today's entertainment and the effect that it has upon society. It is very, very powerful. And the left, like I said, controls these entities. And that's why when conservatives ask, how can we take back society? Maybe Trump will help in that regard. I hate to break it to you, but he won't. No matter how much good he tries to do, he cannot change academia, the media, and entertainment. And as long as you control those entities, you're going to be able to shape the next generation. You're going to be able to shape political and cultural opinion in society. That is what we need to seize control over if we're going to prevail. Otherwise, we'll continue losing the cultural wars, and as the culture goes, so goes the politics.
Well said. I think we'll wrap it there, Selwyn, because that was beautiful. And you mentioned Antonio. I'm glad you did, because he was one of the main inspirations of Saul Alinsky, was he not?
Yeah, I don't know that for a fact, but I'm sure he was. It just makes sense.
I know I had a quote in here because I was arguing with someone who runs a big Democratic following on Twitter, like 100,000 fans, and he didn't know who Saul Alinsky was. And I had the quote written down. I think Gramsci was the one who said, not guns, not bullets, but change their hearts and they'll love their servitude or something like that. And I thought it pretty much sums it up in the 20th versus 21st century front of Marxism. So,
it really does. It really does.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'll make sure everyone goes to selwynduke.com and educates themselves into the ways of wisdom. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future. Good.
Same here. I look forward to it. And I thank you for your time, TJ, and God bless you and your audience.
You're listening to the absolute unadulterated truth, courtesy of the Oh Hail Yeah Show. Want more? Oh. Hail yeah, you do.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the Young Cons podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud. And make sure to check us out online at youngcons.com/podcast. Or chat us up on Twitter at RealTJHale.
But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.